He walked into the diner wearing a faded green jacket, just another quiet face passing through town, until a local bully slapped his coffee to the floor. The room froze. But when part of his shirt slipped and that hidden tattoo came into view, everything changed. Who was this silent man? And why did a single symbol on his chest make an entire town hold its breath? The diner sat quietly at the edge of the river, its neon sign flickering like an old heartbeat in the cold night. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the jukebox always half broken, and the same faces filled the same booths every evening like clockwork. At 8:17 p.m., the bell above the door jingled softly. Heads turned. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered with a lean frame that had once seen war and never quite forgot it. His olive-drab military jacket was faded at the elbows, the collar frayed. There was something timeless about him, like he'd stepped out of a sepia photograph and into modern-day small-town America. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't need to. He moved with the kind of quiet gravity that made people notice without knowing why. Sliding into the farthest booth by the window, he sat facing the room, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. His hands were calloused, his posture still perfect. He placed a folded-up dollar bill on the edge of the table. "Black coffee," he said when the waitress approached. His voice was low calm, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who didn't waste words. "Coming right up," the waitress said, giving him a curious glance. Across the room, a woman in a white dress looked up from her book. Claire Montgomery had been sitting at the counter for nearly half an hour, nursing her tea, pretending to read. In truth, she'd been watching him since he walked in. Not in a flirtatious way, not even in suspicion, just drawn. There was a stillness in him that didn't match the world outside. These days, everything was loud. Fast loud again. But this man, this stranger, in a jacket that looked older than most of the teenagers hanging around Main Street, he was quiet, in a way that made noise feel unnecessary. And yet, as peaceful as the moment was, tension hung in the air like smoke. Claire knew why. Brad Collins sat 3 stools down from her, muscular, loud. The kind of man who made everyone uncomfortable but acted like he owned the room. He liked to stir trouble when things were too still. And Brad didn't like what he couldn't understand. He definitely didn't like that man in the corner. "Who's the green ghost?" Brad said, loud enough for the room to hear, elbowing his buddy at the counter. "Looks like he crawled out of a war movie and forgot to shower." A few forced chuckles echoed, but most patrons fell silent. They'd seen what Brad could do when someone challenged his authority, or worse, his ego. The man in the booth didn't flinch, didn't even lift his eyes. Claire's fingers curled around her teacup. She hated this part, the slow build before Brad acted out. Brad stood up. "Hey," he called across the diner. "You deaf or just rude?" The man blinked once, then finally looked up. His eyes were gray, not cold, but deep, like they'd seen every kind of storm and learned to wait them out. "I heard you," he said evenly. "I just didn't see a reason to respond." The room froze. Brad's nostrils flared. "You think you're better than me?" he barked, stepping closer. "You think you can just sit there with that tough guy act and ignore me in my own diner?" The man looked at him without emotion. He took a calm sip of coffee the waitress had just placed in front of him. "This isn't your diner," he said. Brad's jaw twitched. Claire stood slowly, her voice firm but respectful. "Brad, sit down." Brad didn't even glance her way. Instead, he stepped closer to the booth. "Stand up," he growled. "Now." The man didn't move. Claire's heart pounded. A few other customers shifted uneasily, unsure what to do. Then quietly, the man spoke again. "You don't want this." The room went stiller than still. Claire wasn't sure what it was, the tone, the weight of those 4 words, or the way Brad hesitated just for a breath. But something about it felt final, Not threatening, not violent, just inevitable. Brad clenched his fists. Let's see how tough you are without your coffee. In one quick motion, he reached across the table to grab the mug, but he never touched it. The man moved, smooth, controlled. In a blink, he stood. In the same motion, his hand intercepted Brad's wrist with a quiet thwack, guiding it down to the table in a way that looked almost gentle until Brad's knees buckled. Brad hissed in pain. The man didn't press, didn't twist, just held. And then released. Brad stumbled back, red with rage and confusion. The man sat again, calm as ever. No gloating, no smugness, just silence. Brad stared at him, stunned. One of his friends got up to help him, but Brad shoved the hand away. Claire swallowed hard. Her eyes never left the man in green. The air had changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration. It was something older. Something unspoken. The kind of respect that couldn't be bought, shouted, or demanded. It had to be earned. And this man, whoever he was, had just earned it in 10 seconds, flat without raising his voice. Claire set down her tea. She wanted to know his name. And she had a feeling this town was about to change in ways no one saw coming. Brad Collins was used to being the biggest man in any room and making sure everyone knew it. His presence was loud, thick arms, tight shirt sleeves, a voice that carried like a jackhammer through drywall. He'd ruled the Riverbend Diner for the past 5 years, like it was his personal kingdom. Even the owner, old Gus, used to say, "Don't poke the bear Brad eats here." But something had shifted tonight. The man in the faded green jacket hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even stood until necessary. And when he did, he barely moved, but it was enough. Enough to take the air right out of Brad's lungs. Enough to make the diner fall quiet in a way Brad didn't like. Not one bit. Outside, the river lapped softly against the banks. Inside, Brad's pride boiled like oil on a hot skillet. "You think you're some kind of hero," he snapped, rubbing his wrist where the man had touched him. It still tingled like it had been pressed by something colder than flesh. Across the room, Claire Montgomery set her tea down and stood. "That's enough, Brad," she said, her tone calm but sharp. "Let it go." He turned to her, incredulous. "Let it go." "After what he just did to me, he didn't do anything," Claire replied. "You went at him. He stopped you. That's what normal people call self-defense." Brad's face flushed red, not from anger, but from shame. And shame was something Brad Collins didn't know how to live with. He scanned the diner looking for support. A few regulars avoided his gaze. Others stared down at their plates. Even Denny, the teenager who usually laughed at all Brad's jokes, kept his eyes glued to the ketchup bottle. Only one person looked up. The man in green. And he wasn't gloating. That's what infuriated Brad the most. There was no arrogance, no mocking smirk, just that maddening, calm stillness. Like he'd been here before. Like this wasn't even worth his time. "You want to play tough guy," Brad sneered, walking toward the booth again. "I've seen guys like you, washed up ex-military. Think a few push-ups and a bad attitude make you a man." Still seated, the man looked up. His voice was steady. "You're angry, but not at me." Brad blinked. "Excuse me. You've been holding something inside for a long time. Might have started as pain, turned into bitterness, and now it's got nowhere to go but outward." The diner was dead silent again. Claire stared, lips slightly parted. Brad laughed, but it was forced hollow. "Don't psychoanalyze me, soldier boy." The man didn't flinch. "I'm not analyzing. I'm observing." Brad leaned in close, both palms on the table, knuckles white. "Say one more word, and I swear you'll do what the man asked softly. Prove to everyone here that the loudest voice is the weakest spine." The words hit like a punch to the ribs. Brad recoiled. The man didn't move, didn't threaten, just spoke the truth. And the truth had a strange way of echoing. Claire saw at first the flicker in Brad's eyes. Not rage, not pride. Fear. But fear covered quickly with deflection. "You think you're smart," Brad barked. "You think hiding behind fancy words and dusty jackets makes you better than people like me." "I don't think I'm better," the man replied. "I think I'm just not angry anymore." A beat of silence passed. Brad's fists unclenched. "I bet you sit in corners like that everywhere you go, hoping nobody asks who you used to be." The man took another sip of coffee. "I'm not hiding," he said. "Then what are you?" Brad challenged, his voice trembling now. Some kind of war hero waiting for applause. The man paused. Set the mug down. "Just a father," he said. "Trying to do better." Claire felt her chest tighten. It was the first time he'd given anything personal. And somehow, it landed harder than any punch could have. Brad stepped back like someone had pulled a plug from him. He turned and stormed out of the diner, muttering curses under his breath. The door slammed behind him. Silence lingered. Then the clatter of cutlery resumed. Quiet conversations restarted. The spell had broken, but something had changed. Claire walked slowly toward the booth. "Can I get you a refill?" she asked. The man looked up at her with eyes that held no pride, no smugness, just fatigue. "Sure. Thank you." She returned a minute later with the pot. As she poured, she said gently, "You didn't give him what he wanted." "I've seen what happens when you do," he said. "Yeah," she asked. "What does happen?" The man stirred his coffee slowly. "Things break that can't be fixed." Claire didn't press. She looked at him carefully. "You have a name, or do I keep calling you Mystery Man in my head?" He gave the faintest smile. "Mark," he said. She extended a hand. "Claire." Their hands touched briefly. And for the first time all evening, Mark looked someone in the eye. By the next evening, word had already spread. It didn't matter that Riverbend was small, or that the confrontation only lasted 5 minutes. In towns like this, 5 minutes of silence was enough to stir 5 days' worth of talk. Especially when it involved Brad Collins, the self-proclaimed king of the diner, and a stranger no one had ever seen before. Mark returned at the same time. Same booth, same black coffee. He didn't look around, didn't fidget, didn't care who was watching. He just sat, jacket slightly unzipped, dog tags tucked beneath a plain shirt, eyes quietly scanning the window like it told better stories than the world inside. But people noticed, especially Brad. From the other end of the diner, Brad sat with 2 of his gym buddies, thick-necked men with louder voices than thoughts. They spoke in grumbles and glances, not quite brave enough to confront, but not ready to back down either. Claire was behind the counter watching carefully. She'd seen Mark before Brad arrived, and had offered him a warm smile. He returned it barely, but something in his eyes had softened since the night before. He had said only one thing to her that morning when she passed his booth: "Thank you for yesterday." And somehow, those 5 words had stayed with her all day. But Brad hadn't come to eat. He stood up, slowly rolled his shoulders like warming up for a brawl, and strode toward the booth. Mark didn't look up. "You think you embarrassed me," Brad said loudly, stopping a few feet from the table. "You think sitting there like some war god makes you untouchable." Mark sipped his coffee. "I think you want people to see you as strong, but the way you chase attention says otherwise." Brad's nostrils flared. "Stand up," he growled. Mark finally looked up. His voice remained calm. "No." A few heads turned. Denny, the busboy, froze mid-wipe. The cook peeked from the kitchen window. Brad's lip curled. "You scared?" No, Mark said. "Just smart enough to avoid unnecessary violence." "You're hiding again," Brad snapped. Behind that jacket, that calm voice. "You're just like every guy who used to bark orders and hide behind stripes." Mark's jaw tightened just barely, and Brad saw it. He grinned, proud of the reaction. "Yeah, that's right. I know your type. Mark slowly stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. He was taller than Brad had expected, bigger than he looked when seated. His presence suddenly filled the space around him like a rising tide. I'm not your type, Mark said, and I'm not interested in performing for anyone. Brad stepped closer, nose to nose, then stopped talking. And with no warning, he swung. A heavy, wide right hook, sloppy, fueled by anger. Mark didn't step back. He stepped in. In one impossibly fast motion, he slipped under the punch, pivoted his torso, and landed a sharp palm strike to Brad's chest. Not enough to injure, but enough to knock the air out of him. Brad stumbled backward, gasping arms flailing. One of his friends reached for him, but it was too late. Brad tripped over a chair leg and fell hard onto the linoleum floor. The room gasped. For a second, all that could be heard was the hiss of the coffee machine. Mark didn't move. He just stood there, breathing slowly, eyes locked on Brad's. No one's filming if that's what you wanted, Mark said softly. Brad groaned, trying to sit up. You're gonna regret that. Mark didn't answer, but Claire stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the tile as she came between them. Her voice rang out clearly, slicing through the tension like a clean blade. That's enough. She turned to Brad. Get up and get out. I'm a customer, Claire. You're a liability, she said coldly. And you're done. Brad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then he stood, wobbled, glared. You'll regret backing him, he hissed. This isn't over. As he left, the bell above the door rang like punctuation. The whole diner exhaled. Mark sat again. Claire stood for a second, studying him. Then she turned to the room. If anyone else wants to throw punches, please do it outside. Otherwise, enjoy your meals. A round of nervous chuckles rippled through the room. The tension cracked just enough. Claire poured herself a tea and came to Mark's table. You okay? She asked. He nodded. Didn't want to. But sometimes, words aren't enough. She tilted her head. You've done this before. Mark didn't answer directly. He just stared at the window again, the river glimmering in the reflection of neon. I used to think violence was the first language he said. Then I spent 20 years learning it wasn't. But every now and then, someone insists on speaking it. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat across from him. I think you just made some enemies, she said. He smiled faintly. Wouldn't be the first time. A pause. Why come back? She asked. You knew he'd be here. Mark took a breath. Because fear should never decide where a good man sits. Claire didn't respond right away, but something in her expression changed. Something respectful. And maybe something curious. As the bell over the door chimed again and life resumed around them, Claire realized she hadn't just met a stranger. She had met a storm. A quiet, controlled, deliberate storm. And something told her this wasn't the last time it would shake the room. By morning, the video was already up. A grainy clip, shaky hands, but unmistakable Brad Collins, lunging Mark, stepping in the swift move to fall. No sound, just the movement. The silence after. Someone had filmed it. Claire didn't know who. But by 9 a.m., it had already made it onto a local veterans forum, and from there, it traveled faster than a small-town rumor ever could. The caption read, "Man in green stops the noise. Respect." By noon, the comments section buzzed with speculation. That stance. That move. He's not just ex-military, that's special forces. Delta SEAL. Who is this guy? Someone buy him a coffee. Claire read them in the break room between wiping down menus and checking on deliveries. She wasn't surprised. Something about Mark had struck her from the first glance, not just his silence, but what it concealed. By the time evening rolled around, Claire had already made her choice. The booth in the corner was reserved. Mark entered like he always did, calm, quiet, unannounced. But this time, when he approached the booth, there was a small folded card resting on the table. He picked it up and read, "Reserved for men who don't yell." Management. He almost smiled. Claire approached with a fresh pot of coffee. "I figured you earned a little piece," she said. Mark poured his own cup. "You didn't have to do that." Claire leaned one hand against the table, arching a brow. "You think I'm the kind of woman who has to do anything?" He looked up, and this time he did smile, just a flicker, but real, not for a second. She sat across from him without asking, resting her chin on her hand. "You always this calm? Or is this just your diner face?" Mark stirred his coffee. "I wasn't always. Let me guess," Claire said. "Used to be a volcano. Now you're a mountain. Something like that." They sat for a moment, the quiet settling comfortably between them. Then she said, "You know Brad's not done right." "I know. He's angry. Embarrassed. Small-town kings don't like being dethroned." Mark nodded slowly. "I didn't take his throne," he said. "I just didn't bow." Claire studied him. "You're not afraid of him, are you?" "No. Why not?" Mark met her eyes. "Because fear's a payment I stopped making a long time ago." Claire leaned back, arms folded, impressed. But before she could speak, the bell above the door rang. Brad. And this time he wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, one a local councilman's son, the other a bulky truck dealer known more for his beer than his brains. The room tensed. Brad didn't walk toward Mark. He walked toward the counter, pulled out a chair, and began speaking loudly to a nearby group of men. "Funny how some people waltz into town, act like saints, and suddenly everyone forgets who built this place," he said, voice oily with sarcasm. Mark didn't react. Brad raised his voice. "Guy throws one punch, and people act like he's George Washington." The men around him laughed. Claire rose, but Mark gently lifted a hand to stop her. He stood. Walked not toward Brad, but toward the jukebox in the corner. Inserted a quarter. Selected a song. Old country blues began to hum from the speakers, soft, aching chords that seemed to pour dignity into the silence. Mark turned, leaned against the jukebox, and finally spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, I used to think noise meant strength." The diner stilled. Mark looked directly at Brad. "Then I met men who never spoke a word unless it mattered. Men who didn't bark threats. They walked through war zones without raising their voice, because everyone already knew who they were." A murmur passed through the crowd. Mark continued. "The loudest guy in the room isn't the strongest. He's usually just the most afraid." Brad stood abruptly. "You done preaching?" he snapped. Mark took a step forward. "You came looking for a fight, Brad. I came here for coffee." Brad's face darkened. "You're full of yourself." "No," Mark said quietly. "I'm full of things you ran away from a long time ago. Discipline, respect, and silence." The words dropped like stones in still water. Brad opened his mouth but couldn't speak. One of the men with him shifted uncomfortably. Claire stepped forward then. "Mark," she said gently, "want to help me restock the napkin dispensers?" It was a curveball. Mark blinked, then nodded. "Sure." He followed her to the supply room. Inside, surrounded by paper towels and cans of beans, Claire whispered, "That was poetic and dangerous." Mark opened a box of napkins. "I don't provoke. I just don't retreat." She looked at him, searching. "You really were someone, weren't you?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a single folded photo from his wallet and handed it to her. A young girl no more than 6, smiling beneath a flagpole, holding a paper flag in one hand and saluting with the other. "She's why I'm still standing," he said. Claire looked up, and for the first time saw the full picture. Not just a man hiding from the world, but a father protecting something sacred. The next Saturday brought an unusual chill to Riverbend. The wind off the river carried a bite that hinted of early fall, rattling the awnings of the diner and sending napkins fluttering across tables like white flags of surrender. Inside, the mood was quiet, contemplative. Mark was already in his booth when the rush began. Claire had started to notice it customers who usually came on Tuesdays showing up on Saturdays. Teenagers, who never ordered anything but fries, now lingering longer, stealing glances toward the corner. The town wasn't just curious anymore. It was watching. And Brad hadn't been seen in 2 days. That in itself was newsworthy. Claire poured coffee into Mark's cup. "You've become something of a local myth," she said lightly. "I'd rather be forgotten," Mark replied. "You're in the wrong town for that." He gave a soft smile, but didn't answer. He rarely did when it came to praise or attention. It was as if the spotlight physically pained him. At that moment, the door swung open. 2 strangers entered, middle-aged men, both wearing battered leather vests with faded unit patches on the back. Their posture told the truth, ex-military. Veterans knew each other, the way wolves recognize kin. They scanned the room, eyes locked on Mark. Mark's body tensed just slightly, like a string pulled taut. One of the men walked over. "You Benson." Mark looked up slowly. "I was." The man extended a hand. "Corporal Martinth. We served parallel rotations out east. Word travels. Just wanted to shake your hand." Mark hesitated, then took it. The grip was firm, respectful. "Didn't mean to blow your cover," Martin added with a grin. "But guys like you don't stay in the shadows forever." Claire stood frozen behind the counter. That word again, guys like you. She wasn't military, but she knew the tone. It wasn't casual. It was reverence. Martin and his companion nodded, stepped back and took seats at the bar. They didn't push, didn't pry. Just the salute of presence was enough. But the ripple had begun. A few locals whispered. A regular named Bonnie, who'd always said Mark reminded her of her late husband, gasped audibly. Then it happened. A young boy, maybe 10, ran past a server and tripped near Mark's booth, catching the edge of the table. Coffee sloshed. Reflexively, Mark reached to steady the boy. In the motion, the collar of his jacket jerked aside, revealing the top half of a tattoo. It was old, but sharp. Black ink. A triangle pointing down a dagger through its center. Someone at the bar muttered, "Delta." Claire's heart skipped. She stepped forward before the moment could spiral, offering a napkin to Mark. He took it, nodding once in thanks, adjusting the collar back in place with no expression. But the damage, or rather, the reveal, was done. The diner hushed again. This time, not from threat, but awe. A gray-haired man near the window stood. He wore a faded navy hat and walked with a limp. Slowly, respectfully, he approached Mark's table and lifted a hand to his forehead. A salute. Mark looked up, eyes tightening. He returned the gesture. Small. Crisp. It was as if something ancient passed between them, something no one else in the room could touch. Claire blinked against the sting rising behind her eyes. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was history. Sacrifice. Silence made visible. After the older veteran returned to his seat, the mood in the room shifted. Conversations resumed, but gentler. People smiled at Mark with something new in their gaze. Not curiosity, not fear. Respect. Claire walked over with a fresh pot. "Do I even want to ask?" she said softly, motioning to the tattoo. Mark was quiet for a long moment. Then, "It's a piece of the past. Not something I show." She poured his refill. It spoke louder than a speech. He looked up at her, and for the first time Claire saw it. Not a wounded man, not a mysterious loner, but a man who'd carried weight no one in the room could measure, and chose not to make others bear it. "You ever think about telling your story?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "I didn't do it for stories. Claire tilted her head. Then why? He sipped, then said simply, so other people could have stories of their own. It landed like thunder. Claire didn't reply. What could she say? She just sat beside him for the first time, not as a waitress, not as a manager, just as someone human present. Minutes later, the door opened again. It wasn't Brad, it was a reporter. Young, eager press badge clipped to her coat. "Hi, I'm from the Riverbend Weekly. Heard there was something remarkable happening here. I'd love to do a piece on the veteran who Mark stood." His chair didn't scrape. His voice didn't rise. Respectfully, he said, "I'm not available for interviews." The reporter blinked. "But you're all over local social." "I didn't ask to be," he replied. Claire stepped in gently. "This diner isn't for headlines. It's for people." The reporter hesitated, looked around, then slowly left. As the bell jingled, Claire turned to Mark. "You know you've changed the atmosphere in here, right?" He stared into his cup. "I'm just trying to drink coffee in peace." Claire smiled. "Then next round's on me. Quiet force." Mark chuckled softly. "Please don't call me that." Too late, she grinned. It's already in the comments section. But beneath the laughter, something real had settled between them, a recognition unspoken, but undeniable. And outside, as the wind picked up, the diner seemed a little warmer than before. By Monday morning, Riverbend wasn't the same. The diner, once a sleepy corner of comfort food and local gossip, had become something else, something fractured. There were now two kinds of regulars, those who greeted Mark Benson with nods and firm handshakes, and those who looked down at their menus pretending not to see him at all. The shift was subtle, but Claire noticed it in the small things. A couple from the hardware store who always sat at booth. 4 had quietly started getting takeout instead. A city inspector who'd never cared for military talk suddenly had opinions, loud ones. Even Bonnie, who once called Mark a breath of old-school decency, now hesitated before waving. The tattoo had changed everything. It didn't matter that Mark never spoke of it, never brought it up, never asked for thanks. The very existence of that symbol Delta Force had tilted the balance of Riverbend. Some saw him as a hero. Others saw him as a threat to their comfort. And no one was more rattled than Brad Collins. He hadn't been back in the diner since the incident, but that didn't mean he was silent. He was spreading poison behind closed doors. "Don't be fooled, guys like him hide things. He's dangerous. You saw how fast he took me down." "What if he snaps?" "You really think he's just here for coffee?" Claire heard it all, whispers from suppliers, rumors on receipts, even a voicemail left anonymously that simply said, "You're siding with a killer." She erased it without hesitation. That afternoon, she found Mark, where he always sat, booth in the back, coffee and hand eyes on the window. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked. He didn't look at her, just nodded once. Claire slid into the seat across from him. "It's like this town can't decide whether to salute you or ask you to leave." Mark didn't speak. Claire watched him for a long moment before continuing. "I had a customer yesterday ask me if I was encouraging violence by serving you." He finally turned to her, a flicker of apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she replied firmly. "It's not your fault people fear what they don't understand." Silence settled again. Then Claire leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said, about men who don't bark, who just are." Mark waited. "I want to be like that," she said. A beat. "You already are," he replied. She laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't know me that well." Mark smiled. "I've seen how you run this place, with dignity, calm. You didn't flinch when Brad raised his voice. You never once asked me about my past. That tells me everything." Claire felt something warm rise in her chest. Not attraction, exactly, something deeper. Recognition. Suddenly, the front door slammed open. Brad Collins, this time alone. The room stilled. Brad walked straight toward Mark's booth, fists tight, eyes wild but not angry. Scared. "You think you're better than me," Brad said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "You think just because you have a secret tattoo and some war stories, you get to walk in here and turn this whole town upside down." Mark didn't stand. He looked up, calm as ever. "I didn't turn anything. You just didn't like how people turned away from you." Brad's jaw clenched. "I built this town," he growled. "Sponsored the Little League, paid for the flag at the school. Where were you while I was doing that?" Mark finally stood. And for the first time, he raised his voice just a little. "I was holding the line halfway around the world so people like you could come home and sponsor baseball." The words weren't angry. They were heavy. Brad's mouth opened, but no sound came. Claire stepped forward. "Enough," she said clearly. "This diner serves everyone. But today, Brad, you're not welcome." Gasps rippled. Brad looked around, waiting for support. None came. Even those who'd been silent, the insurance guy, the mail clerk, lowered their eyes. And then something unexpected happened. Martin, the older veteran who had saluted Mark days earlier, stood from the counter. He cleared his throat. "I served 22 years, lost friends in places no one can pronounce. I never talked about it. Didn't need to." He turned to Brad. "But men like him? They're why I got to come home. They're why you get to sponsor Little League." A moment of silence. Then another voice. Bonnie, hands trembling slightly. As she lifted her teacup, "Mark paid for my neighbor's groceries last week." Quietly. Didn't even know her name. Someone else spoke up. "He fixed old Gus's car for free." Whispers became declarations. And Brad. He shrank by the second. Finally, he turned to Mark, one last time. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Mark answered just as quietly. "It already is." Brad left. No slam, no noise, just a quiet door click behind him. Claire exhaled. Mark sat again, the room slowly resuming its rhythm. But something had shifted. Not just a moment of justice, a dividing line. And now Riverbend would have to choose what kind of town it wanted to be. That night, the diner closed early. Not because of damage or chaos, no dishes broken, no punches thrown. Just the heaviness of truth hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Claire stood alone behind the counter, wiping the same glass over and over, though it had been cleaned since the second pass. Outside, the neon flickered, then steadied. Riverbend Diner glowed in the night like a lighthouse for the weary. Mark was still in his booth. He hadn't moved since Brad left. Claire glanced at him, then checked the clock. "No 3 p.m. She sighed, hung up her apron and walked over. This time, not as a waitress, not even as a manager, but as herself. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. Mark looked up. His cup was empty, but his hand still curled around it like it held warmth. "Often," he said. "But I don't run anymore. Not from truth." Claire nodded slowly, then slid into the seat across from him. "You weren't the only one hiding something," she said. Mark raised an eyebrow. She took a breath. "I'm not just the manager here. I own the place." He blinked. Claire continued, voice steady but soft. "Not just this location. I inherited the whole chain. 7 diners across 3 states. My dad built them from scratch. When he passed, I kept the old name and kept my mouth shut." Mark didn't respond right away, just leaned back slightly, letting the information land. "I wanted to see things from the ground," Claire explained, "not from an office tower. So I rotated through locations, working the grill, sweeping floors, pouring coffee. Watching." And judging, Mark asked gently. Evaluating, she corrected. And sometimes, hoping. For what? Claire looked at him, eyes clear. For someone like you to walk in. That stopped him. She smiled faintly, as if amused by his stunned silence. You thought I was just here making tips? No, Mark said quietly. I just never assumed. That's the thing about people who've seen too much, Claire said. They don't assume. They watch. They wait. And when they speak, it matters. Mark studied her. There was no performance in her eyes, no ambition, just a quiet truthfulness or as still water. You're different, he said. So are you. A beat. I saw what you did to Brad, she added. But more than that, I saw what you didn't do. You didn't humiliate him. You didn't mock him. You left him with his dignity even when he tried to strip yours. Mark shifted in his seat. That's not always easy, he admitted. But I've seen what humiliation can do. I've seen the damage it leaves. Claire nodded. So have I. They sat in silence, not awkward, but full. Then Claire asked, Can I ask you something real? Of course. Why this town? Why this diner? Mark looked down at his hands. Scarred, steady, strong. My daughter, he said finally. Her name's Bella. She's 9. Loves paper cranes and hates loud noises. After my wife passed, I promised her 2 things: I'd never put her near war again, and I'd learn how to fold peace with my own hands. Claire's throat caught. She's with her aunt this week, Mark added. But I bring her here sometimes, when it's quiet. Claire swallowed the lump forming in her chest. And what did you mean when you said you were hoping someone like me would walk in? Mark asked gently, turning the question. Claire smiled. Someone who doesn't crave attention. Someone who leads by being, not boasting. This town, it's filled with noise, with men who puff their chests and collapse at the first strong wind. But you're like a mountain. Mark didn't know what to say to that, so she added, and mountains don't ask for praise, they just stand. He finally met her gaze. For the first time, Claire felt him let her in. Not completely, but the gate cracked, and she didn't need to push it open. I've seen a lot of diners, she said, but none of them have what this place has right now. What's that dignity? Because you sat down and stayed. He nodded slowly. Claire stood smoothing her blouse. I want to make this place better, she said. Not louder, not shinier, just better. And I'd like you to help me. Mark looked up. As a consultant, she added, security, integrity, energy. You don't have to wear a badge. Just be you. He didn't answer right away. Then let me think about it. Claire smiled. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. She stepped away but paused before reaching the kitchen. You know, she added over her shoulder, most men think being strong means being the loudest in the room. Mark tilted his head. And what do you think? Claire turned back. I think true strength is knowing when not to speak and still being heard. And with that, she disappeared behind the kitchen door, leaving Mark alone with a full heart and an empty cup. Outside, the neon light hummed softly, but inside something louder had spoken. And Mark knew for the first time in a long time he might just say, yes. Mark Benson never talked about the war. Not because he was hiding anything, not because he was ashamed, but because silence had become a language of survival. He had learned long ago that some memories weren't meant to be retold, not because they were too painful, but because putting them into words made them smaller, less sacred. Still, Claire's question lingered from the night before. Why this town? Why now? So that morning he walked, down Main Street past the mural of forgotten mayors, past the barber shop with the faded American flag in the window, past the elementary school, where laughter spilled into the air like hope. He found himself at the riverside bench. It was old and crooked, but it faced the water still wide, slow. Like him. He sat, pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket, and opened the hidden flap inside. A photo. Frayed at the corners. His wife. Madeline. Hair pinned up, smile, wide eyes, soft and alive. She had taken the photo on his last night before deployment, holding Bella, just a newborn, in her arms. The baby's tiny hand gripped Madeline's finger, like she already knew the world could slip away. Mark traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. It had been 9 years. 9 years since that call from Germany. Since the Jeep crash in the rain. Since the silence on the other end of the line when he'd whispered, "Put her on, please." She never got to say goodbye. He had returned to a home that no longer had a heartbeat. And suddenly, all the wars he'd fought overseas paled in comparison to the one waiting in his kitchen, a baby who didn't understand loss, and a man who didn't know how to be a father without a compass. So he did the only thing he knew. He disappeared. Not from Bella, but from the noise, from medals, from command posts and promotions. He left the Delta Force a year later, asked for no ceremony, just folded his uniform, stored it in a box, and moved to the quietest corner of the country he could find. Riverbend, a town that didn't ask questions if you paid your bills on time and minded your own business. And for years, that's all he did. He raised Bella with quiet mornings, oatmeal breakfasts, and long walks by the river. He taught her to tie knots, fold flags, write thank you letters to her teachers. He never mentioned what he'd done, only what he believed. Be kind. Be strong. Be invisible if you must, but never be cruel. And sometimes, when no one saw, he acted. Paid for a stranger's gas when their card declined. Fixed a mailbox at midnight after vandals knocked it over. Shoveled the sidewalk for the elderly widow next door before she even woke up. Never for praise, never for attention, only for balance. Because he believed deep down that if he could put enough good into the world, maybe Bella wouldn't have to carry what he did. But even shadows have limits. The diner had been his routine, a safe corner, a second cup of peace, until Brad cracked it open, until Claire stepped in, until the town divided and forced Mark to face the very thing he'd buried. The past doesn't disappear. It just waits. That afternoon, Claire found him still sitting by the river. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him watching the water move. He handed her the photo. She held it gently. "Your wife?" she asked. Mark nodded. "She looks like someone who could stop a room." "She was," he said, with nothing but kindness. Claire studied the image. "And the baby, Bella." She handed it back. "You kept her safe. I can see it." Mark let out a long breath. "I didn't know how to be a father," he said. "I knew how to lead men into combat, breach doors, map escape routes. But diapers, night feeds, lullabies, I was lost." Claire smiled softly. She wouldn't say that now. "No," Mark agreed, "because I learned. Slowly, quietly. I watched other dads in the park, asked for advice at the grocery store, read bedtime stories aloud to an empty room until I could pronounce the characters right. And the tattoo," she asked gently. He looked down at the collar of his jacket. "I got it when I was 25. Delta Force doesn't hand those out like candy. It means something. It meant something. Back then, I thought it made me invincible. And now I think it just reminds me of who I was, and who I never want Bella to have to be." Claire looked at him carefully. "That's why you stayed calm with Brad," she said. "You weren't afraid of him. You were afraid of becoming what you used to be." Mark met her gaze, and for the first time he said it aloud. "I don't want to be a weapon anymore." Claire nodded quietly, absorbing the weight of his words. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside a flyer, "Dignity in Silence. A night for the quiet heroes, hosted by Riverbend Diner. Purpose: To honor those who never asked to be honored, I'm putting this together, she said. For people like you. Mark hesitated. I don't want a spotlight. It's not a spotlight, Claire said. It's a soft light. Enough so the quiet ones don't disappear completely. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, he nodded without hesitation. I'll come, he said, and Claire smiled, not because she'd convinced him, but because he'd finally allowed someone to see him. Brad Collins had never been good at losing, not in football, not in fights, and certainly not in front of a town he once treated like his personal audience. But after his last public defeat, after the stare down that ended with him walking out alone, something in him snapped. Not quietly, not slowly. Brad didn't break like a man. He shattered like ego under pressure. And when men like Brad shatter, they reach for the only thing they've ever trusted control through fear. He started with the local newspaper. The Riverbend Weekly had always treated Brad like an unofficial spokesman. He bought ad space donated to causes, brought them exclusive tips on small-town crime. So when he walked into the editor's office with a cup of overpriced coffee and a bitter smile, they gave him 5 minutes. That's all he needed. He spun his story masterfully. Out-of-town veteran with a violent past. Possible PTSD episode at the diner. Threat to public safety. Multiple confrontations. Tattoo clearly associated with aggressive military culture. The headline 2 days later read, "Is Riverbend Safe Concerns Rise After Diner Incidents?" And just like that, the seed was planted. Claire slammed the paper on the counter when she saw it. Mark only raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked, furious. "I've fought misinformation before," he said calmly. "It never dies through shouting. It dies through truth." But the damage spread. That afternoon, Claire received a visit from a city official, clipboard in hand, asking about business licenses and potential liabilities. That evening, a mother left a note under the door. "My son won't be coming back until you make the place safe again." And that night, Mark didn't come to the diner. Claire called him. No answer. She didn't sleep. The next morning, however, a miracle happened. And it began with a teenager named Denny. Denny was the busboy, the kind who rarely spoke, wore earbuds all shift, and kept his hoodie pulled halfway over his eyes. But he noticed things. That was his gift. Quiet kids always noticed. And that night, the night Brad had thrown his punch, Denny had been recording a TikTok dance with his phone propped against a napkin dispenser. Unintentionally, he captured everything. The angle wasn't great, but the action was crystal clear. Brad swinging. Mark stepping in, not forward, but in deflecting, neutralizing, and stepping back. No aggression, no escalation. Just grace, precision, restraint, and the unmistakable flash of the Delta Force tattoo when his jacket shifted. Denny uploaded it quietly, captioned it. "You call this dangerous, I call it control." Within hours, it was viral, not just in Riverbend, but across veterans forums, military subreddits, and law enforcement groups. Comments poured in. "That's tactical discipline. This guy's the real deal. You know how hard it is to neutralize without injuring. That's elite-level control. This man didn't snap. He saved that idiot from breaking his own nose." Claire found the video at 7:43 a.m., sitting in her office with coffee gone cold. By 8:00 a.m., it was playing on the diner's tiny mounted TV. Customers gathered, even the skeptical ones. They watched in silence. And when the video ended, someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole room joined in, not loud or dramatic, but steady, like a slow rain of gratitude. At 8:15 a.m., Mark walked through the door. He paused when he saw the crowd, the TV, the frozen frame of his own body mid-deflection. Then he saw Claire. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, as if to say, You told me truth wins. Mark walked to his booth. The regulars gave him space, but not distance. A few came by to shake his hand. One left a note folded on his napkin. Thank you for choosing calm over chaos. My son was watching. By noon, the diner was packed. Not with gawkers, but supporters. Veterans, grandparents, teachers, kids. Even the city official came back to apologize. But Brad made one last attempt. He showed up at the diner's front window that evening, red-eyed, disheveled, holding a printed screenshot of an old article from years ago. A blurred photo of Mark in uniform overseas during a classified operation. He pounded on the window. This guy's a ghost. He's hiding something. Claire walked outside alone, met him on the sidewalk. The entire diner fell silent, watching. You need to leave, Brad, she said. I'm warning people. You're warning them of what she asked calmly, that there's still honor in the world, that there are men who don't shout, don't bully, don't pretend. Brad's voice cracked. You're making me look like the bad guy. Claire didn't blink. You did that all by yourself. Brad stood there, breathing heavily, as if waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. No one came to his side. No one opened the door. Finally defeated not by force but by irrelevance, Brad turned and walked away. No one clapped. No one cheered. They simply returned to their meals, to the warmth inside. And when Claire stepped back in, she walked over to Mark's booth and placed a fresh mug of coffee in front of him. This one, she said softly, is on the house, from the entire town. Mark nodded. Thank you, he said. But Claire shook her head. No, Mark, thank you. And for the first time since he stepped into that diner, Mark Benson allowed himself a full smile, quiet, but undeniable. Because in a world obsessed with noise, he had won by being silent. By the following week, something remarkable had begun to happen in Riverbend. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was real. And it started with a folded note left on the diner counter. Claire opened it just before the morning rush. Written in neat cursive on plain stationery, it read, I saw the video. I judged too soon. My husband served in Vietnam. He never spoke of it. Now I understand why. Thank you for reminding me. Mrs. Lillian Granger Table. 3. Claire folded the note and tucked it into her apron. That day, 3 veterans from the local VFW stopped by not to eat, but to ask if they could use the diner for a weekly gathering. Somewhere less formal, one of them said. Where silence isn't awkward, it's respected. She said yes, of course. Mark was already at his booth by the window, reading the local paper without urgency. Claire noticed he was halfway through a crossword puzzle. Small human things. The kind of details no one imagined of a man with a Delta Force tattoo. He didn't ask for updates, didn't check his phone for views or shares. He simply sat, observed, and listened. And in doing so, he became the still point in a town that was finally learning to slow down. By Thursday, Claire's idea had taken form. It started as a whisper between her and Denny in the back storage room. Think people would come if we did it? She asked, arms crossed, uncertain. Denny, pulling soda bottles from a crate, shrugged. After what we've seen this week, yeah, they'd come. And so Dignity and Silence was born. Claire printed flyers herself, just black ink on cream paper. Dignity and Silence, a night for the quiet heroes. Stories optional. Presents. Welcome. Friday at 6:00 p.m. Riverbend Diner. No sponsors, no speeches, just a space. By Friday morning, half the town had heard. By Friday evening, they showed up. Men in old uniforms, sleeves too tight now, widows in church hats clutching framed photos, teenagers who had only known war from textbooks, eyes wide with curiosity. Claire dimmed the lights. The diner glowed amber. Mark arrived just before 6. Claire had reserved the entire booth section for guests of honor, but he didn't sit there. He took his usual place. Back corner, window view, quiet. People filtered in slowly. No one rushed. No one asked questions. There was just a soft murmur like wind through tall grass. Then, without any announcement, the moment began. A young man stood early 20s, trembling hands. My dad was a Marine, he said. He never talked. I thought he didn't love me. But after seeing that video, I realized silence wasn't absence. It was protection. He sat down. No applause, just a few nods, a few people wiping eyes. Then another voice, an older woman. My brother came back from Afghanistan different, angry, closed off. We didn't understand. I judged him. Now, I wish I'd listened to the quiet. More nods, and then another, and another. They weren't giving speeches. They were unloading burdens. One by one, people stood not to glorify Mark, but to honor the space he had made, by sitting still, by not retaliating, by not asking for attention. Claire stood near the kitchen watching it unfold with tears in her eyes. This wasn't about one man. It was about every man and woman who had ever carried the weight of service sacrifice or suffering. In silence. It was about healing. At one point, a little girl no more than 8 walked up to Mark's table holding a crumpled drawing. She said nothing, just handed it to him. He unfolded it carefully. It was a sketch, childish, uneven but unmistakable. A man in a green jacket sitting beside a young girl under a flag. The girl had curly hair. The man had a small triangle drawn on his chest. Mark swallowed hard. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Samantha," the girl whispered. He nodded. "Thank you, Samantha. This means more than you know." She smiled shyly and returned to her seat. Claire saw it all. After the final voice quieted, she stepped forward. No microphone, just her voice. "I want to thank you," she said, "for showing up, for not needing answers, for just being here." She paused, then looked directly at Mark, and to the man who reminded us that strength doesn't always speak thank you for sitting still long enough for the rest of us to see clearly. The room fell silent, and in that silence, there was healing. Mark stood then, not fast, not slow, just steady. "I didn't come here to be seen," he said, "but I'm grateful you saw me." And then, without ceremony, he sat again. People didn't clap. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. That night, the diner stayed open late. No one checked the time. No one rushed home. They sipped coffee, shared quiet stories, and for once the world didn't demand noise. Claire moved through the room like a conductor of stillness, her hand brushing shoulders. Her smile steady, her eyes lingering where hearts were softest. And when she passed by Mark's table, she gently touched his arm. "You did more with silence," she said, "than most people do with speeches." Mark looked at her, voice barely audible. Sometimes, silence is the loudest truth. And in that moment, Riverbend learned something eternal. That kindness doesn't need applause. That honor doesn't need a microphone. And that healing often begins when someone simply sits and listens. Saturday mornings at Riverbend Diner were usually filled with the scent of bacon, the scrape of forks against ceramic, and the gentle clink of coffee mugs being refilled by Claire with practiced grace. But that morning was different. There was no tension, no murmurs of judgment, no stares across booths, just peace. And then, just after 8 a.m., the door opened and the room shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift that came with conflict. It was quieter than that. Warmer. A girl no older than 9 stepped inside hand in hand with Mark Benson. She had long, dark hair pulled into a side braid, a red backpack slung over one shoulder, and eyes that held the same quiet fire as her father's. In her free hand, she carried a small, folded American flag, made of fabric slightly wrinkled, clearly loved. Claire looked up from behind the counter and froze. Mark didn't speak, just gave her the faintest nod. Claire smiled wide and genuine. "Is this?" she asked softly. "This," Mark said, "is Bella." Bella looked up wide-eyed, but unafraid. "Hi." Claire leaned down, her voice warm. "Hi, sweetheart. Would you like some pancakes?" Bella turned to her dad, seeking permission. Mark gave her a soft smile. "Just say yes. Claire makes them better than the army ever could." That earned a giggle. As they took their usual booth, Claire brought over hot cocoa, topped with 2 marshmallows and a cup of black coffee. Bella sat tall, her small flag laid carefully beside her plate. Claire couldn't stop watching her, not just because of her gentleness, but because of how clearly she mirrored the man beside her. There was grace in her silence. After breakfast, when the diner had thinned out a bit, Claire approached the table with a gentle request. "Mark, would you mind?" He followed her gaze to a small area near the window, where a folded ceremonial flag rested on a wooden stand. Beneath it sat a basket of small paper cranes left behind from the Dignity and Silence night. "I'd like to teach Bella how to fold the flag," Claire said softly, "if that's okay." Mark glanced at his daughter. Bella's eyes sparkled. He nodded. The entire diner hushed as father and daughter stood together at the window. Mark took the flag from the stand and handed it to Bella. "2 people," he said quietly. "Always 2. It's never folded alone." Bella nodded seriously. "Corner to corner," he instructed. "Triangle. Then again. Tighter. Respectful." Claire watched hands clasped as they folded together, 12 triangles each movement. Careful, deliberate. By the final fold, Bella was biting her lip, focused. Mark smiled. "You did good." He handed the triangle back to her. "You carry this not because it's decoration," he said, voice low, "but because it reminds us who carried us." Bella cradled the flag in her small arms, as if it were made of glass. Then she looked up at her father. "Do people know what you did?" she asked. Mark paused. "A few." "Do you tell them?" "No." Why, he knelt beside her. "Because what I did isn't as important as why I did it." Bella tilted her head. "Why did you?" Mark looked at her, really. Looked, and Claire saw the moment land deep between them. "For you," he said. "So you could grow up and choose kindness without fear." Bella threw her arms around his neck, flag still in hand, and the diner went still. Not out of reverence, but understanding. Every patron who had ever doubted him, every elder who'd misjudged him, every eye that had once followed him with suspicion, now saw him clearly, not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as a father. When Bella returned to the booth to sip her cocoa, Claire slid into the seat across from Mark. "You've raised her well," she said. "I've tried," he replied, watching his daughter. "Why didn't you ever bring her before?" He hesitated. "She's pure," he said. "And for a long time I wasn't. I needed to make peace with my own silence before letting her see what the world might turn it into." Claire reached across and laid her hand over his. "She sees you. All of you. And she's proud." He met her gaze, something soft, breaking loose behind his eyes. "I didn't think I'd ever be enough," he said. "You weren't trying to be enough for the world," Claire whispered. "You were trying to be enough for her. And you are." Just then, Bella returned with 2 paper cranes in her hand, one blue, one white. She handed the white one to Claire. "This one's for your kindness." Then she handed the blue one to her dad. "This one's for your quiet." Mark smiled. Claire's eyes welled up. Without a word, Mark took the crane and placed it beside his coffee mug, next to the sugar packet and his folded newspaper. And for the first time in months, he didn't reach for silence out of habit. He sat in it like a man who had earned it. A man no longer haunted by the weight of who he used to be, but lifted by the reason he chose to become who he was. A father. And that above all else had always been his mission. The following Sunday was slow. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Riverbend Diner, forming soft rivulets down the glass, blurring the outside world like a watercolor in motion. Inside, the lights were dimmer than usual. Not because anyone had touched the switch, but because peace once earned seemed to settle into the very walls. Mark sat at his usual booth, but today there was no coffee. He just sat with his hands around a mug of warm tea, Claire's idea. "Let the war drink rest," she had said with a smile. Across from him, Claire was quiet, flipping through a small leather notebook, a soft pencil tucked behind her ear. On the page were messy sketches and handwritten ideas. "New layout for the diner?" he asked. Claire looked up. "New mission." Mark raised an eyebrow. Claire slid the notebook across the table. Inside, he saw a page titled "The Haven Initiative," a mentorship and job skills program for veterans transitioning into civilian life, hosted inside the diner. He blinked, then looked at her. "I was inspired," she said, "by someone who made a town listen without saying a word." He studied the page again. "You want this to be more than just a place to eat. I want it to be a place where quiet men don't get forgotten, where dignity isn't a forgotten word." Mark leaned back. "It's ambitious." Claire tilted her head. "You don't think it can work?" "No," he said. "I think it has to work." Their eyes met. In that moment, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of history, of bruises healed, of moments unsaid but understood. Claire reached for her tea and took a sip, letting the warmth anchor her. Then she said softly, "You know, I used to think strength looked like certainty. People who stood tall gave speeches, never wavered." And now Mark asked, "Now I think it looks like a man who takes his daughter's hand before folding a flag." Mark's gaze softened. "I used to think grace looked like perfection," he said. "Elegant, untouchable." Claire raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And now he gave a small smile. "Now I think it wears an apron, works double shifts, and fights quietly for people who don't even know they're being defended." She looked down, suddenly overwhelmed by the intimacy of his words. "I'm not used to being seen," she whispered. "Neither am I," he said. A long pause followed, the kind that only existed between two people who no longer needed to fill the air. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the world slowed around them. Then Claire asked gently, "Do you ever miss who you were?" Mark stared at the window, where a single raindrop slid downward like a falling star. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I see Bella. Or I hear someone laugh in this diner and realize maybe I traded one kind of mission for another." Claire reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It wasn't romantic. It was grounding, like two people anchoring each other after too many years adrift. "You know," she said softly, "I don't need grand gestures. I don't want fireworks or flowers, or words scribbled on cards." "What do you want?" he asked. She smiled. "I want someone who shows up and stays." Mark didn't respond with words. He simply turned his hand and gently held hers. A quiet agreement. No promises, no speeches, just presence. Later that afternoon, as the diner emptied and the sky cleared, Mark helped Claire close up. Bella had gone home with her aunt again for the weekend, giving Mark a rare stretch of solitude. But he hadn't spent it alone. Claire stood on a step stool, adjusting a small wooden frame above the counter. Mark watched from the floor, arms crossed. "Careful," he said. "That frame looks heavy." Claire grinned down at him. "What, you're going to catch me if I fall?" "No," he said dryly. "I'll lecture you about ladder safety." She laughed, a real laugh. the kind that warmed the chest and made the rain outside seem like part of the music. Then he looked up. "What is that anyway?" Claire stepped down and turned the frame to face him. Inside was a simple, tasteful photo. It showed Mark sitting in his usual booth, Bella asleep on his shoulder, the folded flag resting on the table beside them. A single caption etched in wood beneath the glass. "Honor isn't loud, but we hear it." Mark stared at it. His throat tightened. "I didn't know you took that," he said. Quietly. "I didn't," Claire replied. "Denny did. He printed it for me after Friday night." Mark ran his thumb along the wood frame. "It doesn't belong up there." "Yes," Claire said firmly, "it does." He turned to look at her, and she added, "Not because of who you were, Mark, but because of who you chose to become." The rain had stopped by the time they stepped outside together. The sidewalk shimmered with reflections. The air smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. They didn't hold hands. They didn't kiss. But they walked side by side, quiet, steady two lives finally moving at the same pace. And in the stillness of Riverbend, a new chapter had already begun. It was a Tuesday morning when the final change arrived. Not with a parade, not with headlines. Just a quiet shift, like the first hint of spring in a town that had endured a long internal winter. Mark arrived earlier than usual. He wasn't wearing his green jacket. Instead, he wore a simple flannel shirt, sleeves rolled forearms strong and steady. For the first time since he'd walked through the doors of Riverbend Diner, the ink on his left shoulder was visible in full daylight, the inverted triangle, the dagger unmistakable. The tattoo that had once made the room go silent was now displayed not as a warning, but as a symbol. Claire was already behind the counter prepping the register. She looked up and smiled, not surprised, not shocked, just full of a quiet pride. "You ready?" she asked. Mark nodded. "I am." That morning, a small crowd began to gather just after 9 a.m., not for an event, not for a spectacle, just because word had spread that something meaningful was going to happen. Denny stood near the jukebox holding his phone, but not filming. "Today isn't about going viral," he said softly to Claire. "It's about memory." At 9:17 a.m., Claire cleared her throat. "Folks," she said gently, "thanks for coming. I'd like to share something we've been working on." She pointed to the far wall where the wood paneling had been sanded smooth and polished. Mounted there in a glass display box was a framed photograph. The same one Denny had taken Mark with Bella, asleep on his shoulder, the folded flag on the table beside them. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "In honor of the quiet ones, for the strength that never asked to be noticed, only respected." Next to it hung a hand-painted wooden carving of Mark's Delta Force tattoo, stylized, softened, carved by a local craftsman with reverence. The room fell into respectful silence. Mark stood just off to the side, hands folded, unsure what to say. Claire stepped beside him. "You didn't want attention," she said quietly, "but you gave us something that needed to be seen." He looked at her. "I just sat down for coffee." She smiled and changed to town. Later that day, a few veterans from out of town stopped by. One left a medal and old service commendation tucked quietly into the napkin holder near Mark's usual booth. Another left a folded note. "I've never had the courage to show mine, but thanks to you, I might." By late afternoon, Mark had officially signed the paperwork. He wasn't just the diner's quiet man anymore. He was now the security and community advisor for Riverbend Diner Group, an honorary position Claire insisted on creating, not for status, but for stewardship. "You're not here to guard the door," she told him. "You're here to protect what matters." Mark smiled. Like pancakes, Claire leaned in, whispering, "Like decency." Just before closing, Bella returned with her aunt backpack in one hand, a folded paper flag in the other. "Dad," she called, racing to him. Mark knelt, catching her in his arms. "You're early," he said. "I wanted to surprise you." "Well," he said, glancing at the wall where his image now hung. "You're not the only one giving surprises today." Bella noticed the tattoo carving and her dad's bare forearm. Her eyes lit up. "You showed it." Mark nodded. "Because I'm not hiding anymore." Bella looked around the diner softer now, warmer, changed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and hand-folded a paper crane made from a page torn from a dictionary. She handed it to Claire. Claire unfolded one of its wings gently. The word there read, "Grace." "For you," Bella said. "Because you're what made Dad brave again." Claire's throat tightened. She crouched down, brushing Bella's hair aside. "He was always brave, sweetheart." I just reminded him of it. The three of them stood in the middle of the diner. No applause, no flashbulbs, just the hum of life continuing. Just the smell of warm bread, the clink of dishes, the sense that something good had taken root. Later that evening, after the last customer left, Claire dimmed the lights and locked the front door. Mark stayed behind, wiping down tables out of habit. "Still working?" she asked. "Old habits," he said. She walked over to him, pausing at the table beneath the framed tattoo carving. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay." Claire hesitated, then asked, "When you first walked in here, did you ever imagine this place would feel like home?" Mark glanced around the worn booths, the scuffed tile, the picture of him and Bella now permanently framed above the corner booth. "No," he said. "But I'm glad I was wrong." Claire smiled. "We all were." Then, as if the moment needed a signature, Bella came running back from the kitchen, holding Mark's old green military jacket. She handed it to him. "You forgot this," she said. He looked at the jacket, faded, frayed, worn by storms, both literal and emotional. Mark knelt beside her. "You keep it," he said. "Why? Because I don't need to wear the past anymore. You're my future." Bella hugged him tight, burying her face in his neck. Claire stood behind them, her hand gently resting on Mark's shoulder. And in that moment, quiet, unremarkable to anyone outside, they formed something unshakable. Not a headline, not a story, but a family. And on the wall above them, the tattoo that once froze. A room now hung as a symbol of something far greater than military strength. It stood for the quiet power of honor, the healing strength of love, and the miracle that begins when a man simply chooses to sit down, stay, and be kind. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know what part of the world you call home. Leave us a comment and share your thoughts about the story. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you respect, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share new stories every week, each one created to honor kindness, quiet strength, and the beauty of human connection. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Your presence here means more than you know.